see, today is March 9th, and so I'm going to call the committee to order here at 7:33. And as Connie mentioned, we don't often have visitors, so welcome this evening to the discussion. And so we just have a few business items to get through here, and then we will get into the kind of the main parts of the agenda that we had this evening. All right, so February 9th meeting minutes. Any changes or adjustments to the minutes from our last meeting?
I liked them. I wrote them.
They were great.
Virginia, you're okay with them?
Yep. Looks good.
Yep, okay.
Back to you, Mark.
Great, thanks, Connie. We'll accept the meetings as the meeting minutes as they're written. Adjustments to the agenda this evening for our guests. I'm assuming you probably saw the agenda maybe on the Front Porch Forum or in on the town website, etc. Are there any comments from the public on items that are not on the agenda?
All good.
Okay, perfect. Well, we will get into that. So something that we had talked about during our last month's meeting, or actually our last few months, we have been talking about a lot about affordable housing, senior housing, and trying to just get an idea of places in Richmond that where potentially the landowners or there's locations in Richmond that might be suitable for additional housing or affordable housing or senior housing in the town. And so there's been a number of ideas that we've been discussing and talking through and evaluating. And so since last month's meeting, I did go ahead with the help of Virginia, and we just put together kind of some notes on a slide deck that to help organize our thoughts, talk about what might be out there, hear feedback, discussions from residents here in the town. And so that's where we're going to start tonight, is just going through that. And then we do have a couple special guests this evening that will also help talk about affordable housing here in Richmond and what that could look like. You know, what is possible. We all know that, you know, over the past few years, there's been a lot of articles written in local publications about the challenges folks have in finding housing here in Chittenden County and in Vermont, period. So lots of communities are discussing what could that look like in our community, what could that look like in our town, and that's really what we're here to talk about tonight, specific to Richmond. So I will share my screen here and just walk through a couple of slides. Really, again, it's organizing our thoughts from the past few months around where is their potential. And let me get to my screen share here. I will pull that up. So I'd say also, as we're going through this, you know, we have a lot of folks that have been knowledgeable about these sites. Virginia, Jay, I don't see Bard here this evening. Was he able to make it? Do we know?
He anticipates joining us any minute now.
Okay, perfect. And you know, feel free to kind of fill in some of the gaps or add any additional commentary on that. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
All right.
Two. Want to switch?
And I honestly don't know how to make this bigger, so we'll go with that as is.
Oh boy.
Nah.
Yeah. Why am I not seeing the presentation mode in this. I don't use.
The Willis Farm Gateway, so that's.
There we
it too.
go.
Yep.
How about that? Is that a little bit better?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Well,
Okay. All right. Oops. So, the first property here, it's a Willis Farm. It's here in the Gateway. It's there on West Main Street. The currently is owned by the Reaps. It's a 10-acre parcel. It's kind of between Route 2 and 89. For those of you that might not be familiar with the terminology, the Gateway is really the part coming from the 89 exit into town. So between the, kind of including the mobile station, that whole segment of Route 2, right before you get to the welcome sign to welcome to kind of Richmond area. So that's considered the Gateway district. So this particular parcel is a 10-acre parcel. There have been interests in the past from the Reaps to do something with this piece of property. There is, was a couple weeks ago, we had a discussion with the owners, just talking about what could there be, what affordable housing options could potentially go in there. We had someone from Champlain Housing Trust join, and just had a discussion with the stakeholders. Some of the barriers to developing this water sewer access water sewer access doesn't currently go that far, and that would be super beneficial for development.
Yeah.
There is, sidewalk connectivity would be a benefit there as well. So folks that maybe lived, worked in that area could access the town and not have to walk on Route 2, which can get pretty busy. And then there was a piece around maybe density not being enough in terms of what is allowed there, might not be high enough to allow a project to work financially. So some of those things that we've talked about, Virginia, Jay, Bard, anything you may want to add there on the Willis Farm?
I'm sorry to jump in late and jump in. I'm just arriving. This is Bard. So here's what I know from conversations with Cathedral Square, which does senior housing, and Champlain Housing Trust. Cathedral Square said, we got to have sidewalks. You don't have sidewalks, it doesn't work for us. So they said, in terms of senior housing, it doesn't work. Champlain Housing Trust, there was an interesting conversation where they described through a variety of sort of development and financing tools where they can take a construction cost per unit of, $450,000 down to a purchase price or sales price of $200,000 more or less. And that's sort of a big deal if you wanted affordable housing. And then we could talk at length about the water sewer. I'll just point out, if you don't know, that our current ordinances say that the current users won't pay for extensions. So extensions have to be paid for by another source or by the developer. It is clear from conversations with other folks that it's usually the developer. That's the most common thing. You build a bunch of houses and you pay for the roads and the infrastructure, and then you might hand it off. And then the last thing I'll say is that the CEO or COO, I forget his title, Michael Monte from Champlain Housing Trust said, as written, the current zoning density is probably a problem. Like he talked about greater density, and also for them, a minimum of 30 units. That's what it takes to make it viable. which is not impossible depending on the size of the units. You know, if you think 3 stories, you can sort of do that, but it depends on how you look at it. And then I will only note in passing that Taylor Newton from Chittenden Regional Planning Commission was saying, hey, you should have like 5 stories and 150 units. And I'll just say, I just note that that's one of the things he talked about. I don't think there's any sort of consensus that that scale fits Richmond or this property or any property in Richmond, given our community. But I share it to point out like the diversity of suggestions that one might receive. Is that helpful at all?
Yes, thank you, Bart. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
and so I could add something from the Planning Commission, Virginia Clark from the Planning Commission. We have talked about, you know, there are 2 places where you could put sidewalks. One is along Route 2, which is problematic. There are these pinch points, areas where, you know, the side of the road comes really close to the road, and then there's the railroad tracks on the other side. So VTrans has always been very reluctant to put sidewalks out there. We must have been working on that for 20 years, the question of getting sidewalks out into the gateway. So the other possible thing that we could do is to put sidewalks from the Willis farm, the Reeps property, across a small piece of land trust property onto the school property and get a sidewalk to School Street. So that's longer, you know, and you have to go a little bit uphill. So whether that would be adequate for a sidewalk connection, I don't really know with the affordable housing folks, but it is another option. You can get to the village another way besides going along Route 2, so via School Street. So that's one thing about the sidewalks. The zoning barriers are probably able to be overcome. So, you know, I wouldn't say that those are like the end of the road because the density isn't quite enough. So certainly that could be something that can be adjusted if there seem to be some distinct advantages for it. So I think that's it from the Planning Commission. Yep.
Virginia, I have a question, just
Yes.
so I understand definitions. How do you define density within, is it like a number per acreage? Is it per square feet? How's it?
Yeah, so density is defined as the number of residential units per area.
Okay.
So what we have currently proposed, well, the density number is a little confusing the way it's currently in the zoning because they have 2 different ways of assessing it, whether you do or don't have water and sewer. So if you don't have water and sewer currently out there, it's 1 residential unit per acre. So we have changed that in the proposals that are currently have gone to the select board. Josh Arneson is putting them on the select board schedule as we speak. But we have proposed a density of 8 units per acre. So in most cases, that will require municipal or some other kind of community system, water and sewer. Most of the land out there in the gateway, you're not going to be able to get water and sewer on site for 8 units in an acre of land. But if you were able to do it, you would be able to put 8 units per acre. And of course, so it depends on the lot size, how many residential units you could put. If you have 1 acre, you can put 8 units. It is possible that we might carve out a special zone where increase, you know, that density could be increased. If you have a bigger lot, you know, that's, let's say 3 acres, you could put 3 times 8, you could put 24 units.
Excuse me, Virginia, define a unit. please?
A unit is either, an apartment or a house or
Well, it's
just where
like by
one,
bedrooms or size or?
nope,
You ju-
it's just a dwelling unit. It's where one set of people live. So
Okay,
it can be any size. It can be a condo, it can be an apartment in a multifamily building. It can be half of a duplex would be one unit. A duplex is 2 units. And we do allow a duplex wherever you can put a one-family house. So that automatically makes it look like the density is twice as much, if you know what I mean. So
yes,
if you have a one unit per acre density under the way our zoning is currently written, you could put a duplex, which amounts to 2 units per acre. The new way that we're writing the density is just the total number of units per acreage.
okay,
So it's possible, since the Willis Farm is a 10-acre parcel, it depends how they divide it up. If they made a lot that was 3 acres, they could put, under our proposed zoning, they could put 24 units. So the question is, how they want to divide it up, and do we need to somehow increase that density, which is not impossible. That's something that zoning does. It manipulates the density if we wanted to do that.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Bard, you have your hand up here.
Yeah, so two, further expository comments. The first is, in addition to number of units per acre, I think Mr. Monte mentioned lot coverage sometimes comes up. So that's another one. If you think what limits it, it's units per acre, lot coverage, parking requirements and setbacks. All of those constrain what you can or cannot do in combination, right? So it's sort of an ecosystem, if you will, it seems to me. The other thing I'll say about sidewalks, the folks from Cathedral Square are familiar with the property. So even if you could create a sidewalk, have you ever used a wheelchair or pushed a wheelchair?
Yes.
So
I've pushed them.
yeah, so it's somewhat laughable to think that there is a sidewalk up and down the hill in that sort of lower right corner that would be usable by a wheelchair. And that's the Cathedral Square perspective, because they're talking seniors and aging in place, which is different from Champlain Housing Trust, where it's a nice to have, maybe not a gotta have. It's not necessarily people in wheelchairs and aging in place. So that's the subtlety of that. On top of all of this, of course, is what do the owners of the property want to do? And it is, I said this to some of the folks on the in the meeting tonight. Having talked to a variety of folks, I don't think there's any enthusiasm for publicly subsidized water sewer for commercial development and market rate housing among the Water Sewer Commission, maybe the ARPA committee, maybe the select board. That said, I think that a tipping point that could change the equation is affordable housing. So key question there is, what do the REAPs want to do? They have most recently contemplated water sewer lines up and down the hill, not along Route 2. And the details of that, are still unclear. But I had a sense, at least, that at the moment they were not, they didn't seem to be jumping on the bandwagon of affordable housing or affordable senior housing. Jay, does that seem fair based on what you've heard?
I would agree. There are a number of factors that are influencing the REAPs. One of them is their wish to use the property as essentially their retirement income. So they want to keep ownership of any units out there, which I can certainly understand. And that doesn't really mesh with them being operated by Champlain Housing Trust. Champlain Housing Trust prefers to own the units. But I agree with Bard that a sidewalk up the hill doesn't seem practical. You know, it would be something where you'd have to have almost a funicular railway to make it work. And as far as water and sewer goes, you know, I have not been on the Water and Sewer Commission as long as Bart and David Sander and company have. Greg Tucker, who's here tonight, was on the Water and Sewer Commission. I talked to him the other day. He said he's never had such a good time. But the factor is, if we run water and sewer from its existing terminus on West Main Street to the REAP property, affording it becomes very problematic because as Bart said, we cannot use reserves and we cannot make the existing water and sewer users pay for it. We would have to assess the charges, the bond payments to the people who own land along that corridor. And if you can visualize that corridor, there's some big chunks of land that have negligible grand list value. So in order to pay the bond, we would have to commit, you know, commensurately charge those who do have grand list value that much more. Without getting into the full spreadsheet that we've looked at, we would be looking at charging just homeowners, not the REAPs, not Black Fork Towing, not just the average homeowner on that stretch, approximately $10,000 per year just to retire the bond. And I, in good conscience, can't ask somebody to do that when, you know, what we're really trying to do is lay the footing for expansion into the gateway. I can't tell a homeowner I want them to pay for that public goal. So absent a big grant, we've actually got some grants that potentially could apply, but absent a really deep-pocketed agency giving us a huge grant, I don't see how to make water and sewer out there work going along the Route 2 corridor. It would have to be some arrangement where the REAPs would probably, the only arrangement I've heard that would really work would be coming down the hill and from the school. But the sidewalks, I don't have a solution for that. And sidewalks are extremely expensive. And I don't know how we would be able to pay for sidewalks going all the way out to the REAPs along Route 2 without, again, a big grant.
Great. Well, I do want to continue moving forward. Really today, we just want to kind of outline like what is possible, what are some of the barriers to that. Obviously, there would be a lot of challenges to this property. Bard, yes.
Hopefully the final comment I'll make is what's still in play is, if you look at this map, the easement through the conserved land under the control of the land trust, and what the details of that are. It is not clear to me that at this point whether the easement would allow water and sewer service beyond the REAPs anyway. It would appear their intent anyway at the time that they wrote the easement was to limit it to the REAP property or Willis property and exclude all the other properties. If that were so and continued, then we would be faced, it would seem to me, with a single property that has to pay for water sewer to get there and make it work. So if the current users can't pay for it, all the other new users can't pay for it, who's left is the one piece of property owned by the REAPs.
So if the REAPs were willing to pay for that line, even if the school is, even if the land trust is not willing to modify the easement, if the REAPs were willing to pay for the line and the line terminated at their property, and if the REAPs wanted to own the market rate, affordable and senior housing that hypothetically might be constructed, sidewalk would not necessarily be a requirement. Sidewalk is a requirement if the existing Champlain Housing Trust Cathedral Square get involved. If it were done by a private landowner, they could have sidewalk or not. Obviously, sidewalk would be nice to have, but if the REAPs were to build there, that would be something that would not necessarily be an absolute hard and fast rule. But again, that's going against what we currently understand the REAPs' desires to be.
I'll only add that Cathedral Square walked away quickly and said, if you can't get sidewalks along Route 2 there, like they dismissed it quite quickly and moved on to other sites.
Right.
Champlain Housing Trust was more ambivalent. Be really nice to have sidewalks. How do you get anywhere from there? but they weren't as absolute in my memory anyway as Cathedral Square. So that's kind of a yellow light from one and a red light from another.
Right. Now, I should mention as an addition, I think a lot of people on this call are aware that there is a committee meeting right now, not right now, but meeting currently, to explore, what we want to see happen in the gateway. And they're doing focus groups, they're asking all kinds of good questions. And even if as the ARPA committee chair, I don't really see us dumping a big pot of ARPA money on this unless we have it in writing that there would be a sizable number of affordable housing units out there, because otherwise we're just subsidizing a private landowner, and I can't see us doing that. But it's possible that we might look back in 10 years and say, look at all these nice sidewalks. But I don't know how we would get from here to there right now. That's to be determined.
One thing that I could add, in the planning commission discussions with the REAPs, they have expressed a willingness to have internal sidewalks on their property. So paths between buildings, depending on what happens to the rest of that property, there might be paths that connect to other residences along the gateway, and paths that connect to the buildings within the Willis Farm itself. So.
And of course, the yoga studio.
Absolutely. The yoga studio, got to have a path there.
So let me expand on what Cathedral Square is interested in. Is not, sidewalks to like a mountain bike path. It's sidewalks to things like a grocery store, a doctor's office, post office, things like that. And if you look at AARP, livable communities, that's the kind of things you talk about. Can you walk to those kinds of community resources? And so, again, it's the difference between Cathedral Square, where they go, if you can't walk to those places, we're not interested, where Champlain Housing Trust was, well, you can talk about it.
Right. Great. Well, thank you for that. Moving on, the next slide or next parcel of property is Jelena Court, their buttermilk development. I think we're all familiar with this Jelena Court, the building that's right there behind the Richmond, next to the Richmond Community Kitchen. So that piece of property there is a 6-acre parcel. About half of that is in the floodplain. It's a pretty deep lot there. If you can look at the map, you can see the town hall library there. It kind of wraps around the library property there. And there are currently 14 housing units that are built and occupied. They do have current approved plans for up to 45 total units, so that would be an additional 31. And the latest news we had is that the application is incomplete for the rest of those units to be built, and they do need an Act 250 permit. Since those plans have been were proposed and put together, the housing crunch in the area has only gotten more intense. So, the developers are interested in putting additional housing, less commercial space in there. I believe the first floor, and I'm not sure exactly how it's written, but there is a ratio of commercial spaces that would need to be built in addition to the housing units above. So they would be interested in potentially turning those new those requirements into additional housing, right? Instead of adding additional commercial space. The previous town planner that we had did some rough, I think, back of the napkin math, and said that potentially up to 90 units could fit in that parcel there. But that is not something that has been proposed or approved as of yet. And I think one of the barriers, on the plus side, right, there are plans. It is water and sewer is there on site. And I think the developers have stated in the past that they haven't been interested in putting in any kind of affordable housing. So that's kind of some of the information on this piece of property. And Bart, I see your hand up. So
I'll only add, I will not throw any former employee under the bus, but I'm not sure where we come up with 90 units or how that math works. I further observe that there have been, in the past, been significant opposition to the floodplain, and there are areas of this property that have sensitive flora and fauna in the riparian buffer zone, between the river and sort of hillside. And so there are this is not sort of a walk in the park in terms of, oh, let's just put parking down there. I think there's combinations of parking, lot coverage. This map does not show clearly where the floodplain is, I don't think, but it is kind of along that line where the white area, and then like above it as well. So the buildable zone is kind of limited. And even in some of that, there has been at least stated opposition to things that impact things that are assumed to be wildlife corridors and sensitive flora. So that will just play itself out. It obviously has been in play for what now, 10 years, more or less. And how that then plays out into the future in terms of density. I believe there was one conversation, well, hey, will you give us 90 units if we have 10 units affordable for 10 years?
Right.
I will only say that the affordable housing people with whom I talked literally laughed when I mentioned that. They thought, well, that's ridiculous. Who would ever agree to that deal, was basically what was said. And I just share that for what it's worth. I'm not saying, leaving my opinion aside, it's what the affordable housing folks said in terms of sort of return on investment or trade-off, if you will.
So, and I mean, the 90 units is not like it's either 45 units or 90 units. There's clearly room for some negotiation in there. Whether we want to relook at the Jolena Court zoning district and look at the commercial space requirement. At the time that the interim zoning became the regular zoning, there was much more interest in having this be part of our downtown with commercial, stores, with commercial areas. Whether that's the same now as it was before, we have unused commercial space in our village. Do we want to try to hold on to commercial space that may or may not ever be used? Jolena Court's feeling was, we're going to make this somewhat affordable by making small units. So it's not like it's perpetually affordable or subsidized in any way. It's just that there are lots of small units. It is adding housing. So that's a question, is that useful just to add housing? Maybe that is useful. Maybe it's not useful. If we can't really work affordable housing in here, is it good to have just more housing in general? It has sidewalks. It has, a very accessible building. The floodplain and the riparian areas are in like the lower half of that picture that you see for the most part. The upper half, the upper 3 acres doesn't have those features. So, the question is whether the Planning Commission should be considering giving them some extra units. Do we want to consider giving them a density bonus, which basically means if you help us out in some way, we will allow you to put in some extra units, which is good for you and it's good for us. And we've considered various ideas for density bonus, like you could make more town parking, you could make them super energy efficient, which serves energy goals. I think they all, if they're on the ground floor, they can be more mobility accessible. So, I think there are some things to look at there and not, I mean, there are some barriers, but it's not a case that we might just want to write this off. This place is served by water and sewer. This place is served by sidewalks. This is set up for apartments, for multifamily housing. It's already got multifamily housing. Do we want to just ignore that and try to squeeze the multifamily housing in somewhere where maybe it's not even quite so appropriate as this? So anyway, just some things to think about. The Planning Commission hasn't retaken up this zoning district yet, but we will at some point if we, especially if we get some direction. So.
Great. Gina, would you like to chime in there?
Yeah, I just had a question. Where did the 90 units come from as far as the zoning? How many, if it's 6 acres, how many acres or what percent of an acre do they need per unit at Julina Court?
Well, at Julina Court, they currently are allowed 15 units per acre of developable land. Now, this formulation was put in place by an even prior to our previous town planner, who felt that we should write our density in terms of developable land. Now, most density is not written in terms of developable land. It's written in terms of the size of the parcel. So this is 6 acres. So if you had 15 units per 6 acres, then that gives you 90 units. Now, it doesn't mean that you can build all over it, but if you can fit the 90 in the developable portion, then the rest of the acreage supports that density. So this would require a change in the way we talked about the density in this particular zone. This is the only district that we talk about density in this way on the developable acres. So, so that's where the 90 came from. And their original plans, the Julina Court plans, had 4 buildings planned. Probably this parcel is not going to support 4 buildings. They were going to put the rest of their 31 units in the second building, which is what they're working on right now, trying to get their plans organized. And then they were going to have 2 other buildings that were completely commercial, which may not make sense once you've put in 45 residential units on 3 acres to have 2 commercial buildings there. We just need to relook at the whole thing. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
Yes, it does. Thank you. And also, I think a good bonus might be if they put a preschool in the lower level instead of commercial, because unless it's a home preschool, you have to have town water, and it's right across from what the playground, which will be hopefully ARPA, hopefully a new playground. And it would be a great location, and I think a lot of families would really perfect location, and families would appreciate that.
Yeah, well, people have
I know it's not up to you, but
have proposed lots of good ideas. We want a bagel shop there. We want, there are things that would be really nice in those lower commercial spaces. Unfortunately, it's more difficult apparently to get financing for a mixed use building that has apartments on the top, businesses on the bottom. It's harder to get financing. That's one barrier that is not up to us. And of course, we can't do anything about who goes in there. All we can do is set the stage for what we want. So the question is it better to have a building with lots of unused commercial space, or put apartments in there. I don't know, I don't know any authority that we have to require that they put a daycare in there. So, good idea, though.
Bard?
Yeah, I think those are all good points, and I think that actually has come up in the past about, hey, what a great location in the middle of town. So again, one of the things is the more you build in the buildable area and you spill over parking into the other areas, you start to bump into opposition about a variety of things, including, like, if you look at where the water could actually flow in flood stage, if you take down things like trees and barriers, it tends to pick up speed and is more erosive. And so that's some of the comments that I've heard from people, like, concerned about putting parking, clearing out land further down below, which is one of the things that you'd probably want to do to support greater density up above. The other thing, it's not lost on probably any of us, about traffic and pedestrian flow. At one point, there was a map from the owners of this property that showed the agricultural access as being a road through the town center property. Just as a point of fact, it's not a road, it's an agricultural access point. And so that's sort of, I'm not saying it's impossible, but to assume it's a road because people drive tractors on it is a bit flawed. And so then you think more broadly about traffic flow. One of the things that I've heard more about in the select board the last few years are the current problems in that intersection by the Richmond market. And one can assume with more traffic, you're going to deal with greater problems. And how do we deal with that? Not insurmountable. I just think of it as wrinkles to be dealt with, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. Any other comments on this before we move forward? All right. Another piece of property or parcel in the area is the Furr farm. I think many of us are familiar with it. Going out Huntington Road, past the Stone Corral Brewery and that direction. The 200+ acre parcel. It's currently farmed. And I'll say the owners have not expressed interest in developing it. But something that is of interest or a positive is that it is at the end of the water sewer line. So again, the challenges that we may be faced with the Gateway property on the Willis farm, this property could be much more easily serviced if there was something developed there. It's obviously contiguous to the village. There's also sidewalks that could be easily extended to that area. The owner, over time, the owners might need additional uses to make continuing of farming financially viable, as we've seen with many farms across the state needing to diversify to stay farmland. There is again, farming and homes aren't always the best neighbors right next to each other. So that is obviously a barrier and a concern. And, the large portion really on the northwest side, or the side with the river, is in a floodplain. So again, this was, I think, to the uniquenesses of Richmond, there's not a lot of property that's easily developable with the mountains, the highway, the railroad tracks, etc. So that does make it difficult to find some properties. So I'll open it up and see if anyone has any additional comments.
I'd just like to ask, because one hears rumors, one hears gossip and scuttlebutt, none of which is any value at all. But recently I've heard gossip, rumor, and scuttlebutt that the FARs might be more open now than they once would have been regarding potentially developing some of that. I have not had a conversation with the FARs. Has anybody here had a conversation within the last couple of years with them about that?
Yes, I have talked to both the, I won't say the older generation, because Peggy Farr still actually has all of this property, owns all of this property in her name. But the middle generation, which is my generation, Terry and Chuck, who do some of the crop work, you know, the growing of the corn and so forth, the harvesting of the corn. And then the younger generation, which is their children, Ashley and Aaron, currently run the farm. So I've had several conversations with them, and they're open to thinking about it. You know, the thing about farming and residents as not being good neighbors applies mostly to dairy farming. And I think they still hold out hope that they can do dairy farming because it's what they love, but they are also experimenting with other kinds of farming. And the farming of vegetables is not such a problem with residences nearby. The Richmond Terraces property was carved out. So Richmond Terrace is on Thompson Road. I don't know if you can point that out, Mark. Yep, that property
that
right
one right there.
there. Yeah, it's kind of a T-shaped property, and that was carved out of the far, you know, the sort of the upper edge. It's like a bowl, the Far farm on the south side of the road, the Huntington Road. It's kind of a bowl that rises up to kind of hills, and on top of the hill that borders on Thompson Road was the Richmond Terraces, which is a Cathedral Square property, I think. It's elderly and handicapped property. So there seem to be other places possibly on the margins of their parcel that might possibly be able to be developed in some way. We haven't really looked at it at all, but they seem to be open to having a discussion about it and, you know, to think of what other kinds of uses might be compatible. So I don't think housing is their biggest interest, but they seem to be open to talking about it. They're, you know, the younger generation is kind of examining their options for making this a paying enterprise. I mean, it's wonderful to have that little farm there on the edge of the village. And it's like an amenity, really, for the people who live in town to be able to walk out there and go to the sunflower maze and, you know, get eggs and meat out there at that property. So we don't really want to do anything to discourage them from farming. It's kind of a conundrum because it's nice to have it there as a farm as to have it open space. On the other hand, it's one of the only pieces of land in Richmond that's contiguous to the village, you know, to the water and sewer lines and the sidewalk. So, you know, in the future, we would kind of like to have a plan going that would look to the future if they weren't successful in making it a farm, or they decided they didn't want to do that, or they decided they didn't want to use the whole thing for a farm, that we would like to somehow involve housing in that plan. So anyway, so they're, in answer to your question, Jay, they're kind of open to talking about it because they're a little unsure about what their absolute direction is right now.
I've just, again, as a member of the select board, it's not my place to say, I want such and so residents to develop the land the way I want. But I'd love to have discussions. I've long had my eye on that stretch because it's contiguous to the village. It's not, you know, if you visualize Thompson Road there, one of the differences between Thompson Road, obviously, and Route 2 is that Thompson Road is not a drag strip, if you know what I mean. And I like the idea of housing where you don't risk your life and limb stepping out of your front door. That's just a little peculiarity I have. I chuckled at the first moment though about housing and dairy farms. I grew up next to a very large dairy farm. It was the immediate next piece of property over. And the one thing I'd like to say is dairy cows, the ones that are allowed to graze in an open pasture, get very curious. Because about 3 or 4 times while I was a kid, I would wake up of a morning and look out the window, and Farmer Price's cows would be looking in my window. They would just push down the fence and they would go through, and the other cows would say, I wonder where that cow is going.
Yeah.
It was a special time, is what I'm trying to say. So I appreciate that, you know, there's a certain romance to living next to dairy farms that not everybody is up for, but I enjoyed it.
They are talking about goats.
What's not to like about goats? I love
Yeah,
it.
well, if you want cows pushing over the fence, wait till you see what goats do to fences.
Oh, I know goats. My neighbor, Mr. Pratt,
Oh.
just up Route 2 from me, you know, where the kennel used to be, he has goats now, and they're
Mm.
fascinating to stop and talk to.
Yep, they're very
Mhm.
mischievous, shall we say. But anyway,
In Jonesville, from the grandmas.
All right. Great. Well, we'll move on. I think this is the last slide here. The last piece is Brown's Court. So this is heading out of town up to Jericho Road. We know where Brown's Court is. 4-acre parcel. It's currently owned by the town, park, field. So, you know, it is, you know, positives, right? It is serviced by water sewer, good connectivity for sidewalks to the village and schools. It is set back from the road, so it could be a larger building, could be unobtrusive from the main road there. And then some barriers is finding a developer, right? It would be create a unique relationship between the town and a developer to do something here. The town was to hold on to it. You know, obviously, folks may want to retain the open space in the village, and the zoning changes. Zoning would need to be changed to allow for that greater density for multifamily housing in that particular spot. So Bard.
Well, I'll preface this by saying this is so hypothetical, you know, but when I had conversations with Cathedral Square and Champlain Housing Trust, they're attuned to the different towns, and they're looking at maps and saying, you know, if they're thinking like Cathedral Square is one example, and this is a supposal, not at all a proposal, but they said in that upper quadrant, a sort of, if you know the terrain, it's proximal to the ravine, kind of a ravine up there. Said, hey, you know, I think we could put our minimum number of units up there, sort of tucked ball field down below. I'm not saying that's a good idea, or it's actually a proposal. I'm just saying that was the conversation that we had. And it was based on a combination of things, including water, sewer, road, sidewalk. And frankly, I think, at least at that point, their desire to maintain the integrity of open land and parkland, you know, at one level, you started to think, oh, you know, you could have, as an example, senior housing with people looking out at a softball game out there, which is a kind of community kind of thing. So I'm just putting it out there to say that was a very hypothetical first stage conversation.
So Bard, I don't know if you know, because you came in late, but about 8 of us are here from Brown's Court. So
I know some of you are from Brown's Court. And there are still conversations about what do the deeds and everything say. And so all those things are, you know, things to be resolved. I believe there's a document from 1911 or something.
1913.
The Richmond
Oh, wow.
Baseball Association, which I don't think exists anymore. And if I don't know if I read it correctly, but it seemed like they bought it and gave it to the town. So that's all, this is all hypothetical.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a good idea or not, but it came up.
Well, I'm Carolyn Marshall, and I went in and checked on that in the last couple of days. And I see where it was given to the Richmond baseball. Let's see, what was it? The Richmond Baseball Association.
They bought it, yes.
Jack Mary was involved in that. His son lived across the street from me for years. And I was with the understanding that that property couldn't be used for anything but recreation or ball field. I did try to check that out. I couldn't find where that was purchased or given to the town.
Well,
I have
I'm
those
only,
documents. I have those
I'm only-
documents open on my screen, the exact documents you're referring to.
I'm only looking at those documents, and I will say it was hard to read on my phone. So this is a factual question. Who owns it and what are the restrictions on it? I'm just saying, I read it this afternoon and that's how I read it. But I'm not the person who would make this decision. In my opinion, as a select board or anybody else, we'd hand it off to an attorney to say, sort these things out, the deeds, the covenants, sales, and what are the deeds, restrictions, etc. I will say, as a long, having lived here for 30 years, that's what people have said for 30 years. Oh, you can't use it for anything other than baseball.
Recreation.
I can
Well-
actually quote you verbatim what it actually does say. There's Linda Parent was good enough to send scanned copies of those documents, which I previously reviewed. And it explicitly said that the Constantines, Alfred and Teresa Constantine, have the right of first refusal to repurchase the property if at such time it ceases to be used as a ball field. Those are the specific people who have right of first refusal. They're of course long deceased. There's nothing else in any of those papers that says it must still be used as a ball field. Neither Bard nor I is up there with a surveying tape making measurements. I want to emphasize that. It was just simply a matter of curiosity. What do the documents actually say?
Yeah.
And the only thing they actually say is that two long deceased people have the right to purchase the land if at some point it ceases to be used as a ball field.
I think the most important thing is, this is Carolyn again, is that that piece of land is used a lot. It's used by the elementary school. They bring the kids down there for physical education. It's used for softball in the summertime. It's used constantly for different things, and people walk there a lot. They
Oh, sure.
walks up and walk some.
I know you all have been burned before, such as when the police department just kind of said, I wasn't privy to this whole project, but at one point some people
Right.
had the idea they were just going to build a police station up there and didn't ask anybody. So I know where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Or the tennis courts.
Right, and at some point, I think there was going to be a big paintball range up there. I mean, every time somebody has a hairball, cornball idea, they
Everybody, every
Sure.
time somebody wants to build more housing, it's on Brown's Court. Every time.
Well,
And
what you've heard tonight is that we are also looking at Thompson Road. We're looking at the Furr Farm. The fact that it comes up does not mean it's the only topic under discussion, and it's important to keep those straight. If I could put down a stake in the ground and say this is where we're building, I've already said where I would like to do it. And it's not Brown's Court.
right,
I think it's not the optimal place because of the factors you've just said. But I also cannot tell the Farrs start building. They're private owners. They can do what they like with their land.
so we have to find out who owns Brown's Court ball field.
No, the town does.
The
I'm
town
ambiguous, but
owns
the
it.
town
The
owns it.
question is, what are the parameters around the town ownership? I think, but to this regard, I am not the subject matter expert at interpreting deeds and sales and covenants and stuff. That's where we go to an attorney and go, what does this say? And I'll just point out there are subtleties of sale versus leases, but it starts with the question of what's desirable there. And, if I live next to it, what's desirable is nothing. It's great to like have nothing there.
Mhm.
But then the question is, what is allowable as well as what's desirable? And I think that is the discussion. If it's not allowed, it's end of discussion. If it is allowed, then the discussion doesn't end there, it seems to me.
And what
I
else
will-
I mentioned that when we're talking about Browns Court, one thing that people forget is what if we made the ball fields nicer? You know, work on Browns Court does not necessarily consist of let's get rid of the ball fields. Maybe we could make them better.
Well, not everyone will remember this, but when my daughter started playing softball, I made a huge stink. The first time when I went up there, literally the backstop was falling over. At the same time that all of the baseball fields for the boys down at Volunteer Green had been improved. I was not on the select board at the time, but there were significant improvements made. This is 10 or 15 years ago, probably 15 years ago. And so that's part of it. And, you know, this is part of the discussion, which is not just legal, but political and social and ethical. It seems to me what's allowable is just the first question. And if nothing is allowed to go there, then you don't keep talking about it. If something were allowed there, then you'd say, well, what's desirable beyond what's allowable? And I totally get if I lived next to the baseball field, the softball field, I'd probably prefer nothing. Leave it as it is. That's just what it looks like, I think.
I appreciate you, Bart, talking about allowable versus desirable, because I think
Right.
that's a good way to look at it. And actually, Alan and I do live, we're the ones that are right next to the court, to the ball field, and right by the entrance, which I kind of looking at your slide, I would add another barrier, which would be traffic on that. If it's one thing, if you have a senior housing in it over the far side, you're making some assumptions maybe that not many cars will be coming through, but you only have one entrance and exit right there, which has actually been some of the downsides I think people have found with that space before. And that would be the other barrier I would say is, unless you go through Burnett Court, if you also went through Burnett Court, there's just a path there between the ball field and Burnett now. If you were to do that, the gully is there and the ravines are all around, but that's a barrier I see. I don't know if we hope we'll be around for a bunch of years, but and I want to see housing. And
Thank you, Mary Claire.
there's part of me that says no, and at all, I don't want to see it. And you're right, it's what's allowable and what's desirable. So thank you for that clarification.
Hey, this is Alan Oliver speaking. One of the things that I noted earlier on, particularly with Cathedral Square and their insistence on sidewalks. Yes, you have sidewalks running near the property, or at least on Jericho Road, but you get somebody on a wheelchair or a motorized wheelchair and head down to the center of the village, they're in for one hell of a ride.
That's true.
And coming back up that
And a
hill
hell of a slog.
is not going to be fun. Anyhow, I throw that out for whatever it's worth.
Does anyone know why this softball field is not on the property of the schools? I mean, don't they have a lot of room out behind them where they could have ball fields or?
It's also floodplain back
Well,
there.
no, the behind the school is, they do have various ball fields.
Yes.
But this one is a softball field that was built long before the school was put up there. I mean,
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So,
Historically, I think somebody said it goes back to 1913. I mean,
yeah, so they don't have room for this softball field out in the school's property or?
Short answer is no, I don't believe they do.
Well,
I'm-
let's go to history. So I will say, just as one member of the community and now select board, when the question of the police building came up, I said, well, you know, there's a softball field there. I have probably coached 100 practices and games on that field. I said, did you talk to the Richmond area youth softball folks? And the answer was no. Well, maybe you should. I don't know. I'm out of the loop. I don't know how it's used today. I'm not in touch with what fields are used by whom anymore, but I think it's a really good question. What fields are used by whom and when?
So I can tell you that during the, as Carolyn said, during the spring and summer, you will see, it looks like girls softball leagues playing, young ages to, I don't know, teenagers, I can't tell anymore. And when we first moved here in the mid 80s, it was still used as a softball field for adult leagues, mostly male leagues, I think. And it went that way for quite a while. First, I think 10 years we were here, and we moved here onto this street in 85. We used to live on Thompson Road, by the way. So that was 85. They were still using it as a softball field, but just basically adult leagues. And there are all sorts of problems with those adult leagues at that point. And then they just started using it for girls. And that's how I've seen it mostly. And the school has used it sometime. But I don't think it was ever really a question of whether the school had space. I think this has always just been a ball field.
It does seem like the schools have a lot of space behind them.
Yeah.
I mean, I've gone up there with my grandchildren, and my kids went there too, but you walk out behind both of those schools and there's a lot of grassy areas. I don't know if they're all needed. So
can I say, I have a bias and an opinion about this because I coached softball for like 6 years. And I will observe, in my experience, the girls' teams got second-class treatment after the boys' teams. I'll just put that out there. This field was used by the town softball leagues as opposed to the school softball teams. And my daughter played on both. So the elementary school does not have a softball team, the middle school does. So for the younger kids and for off season, I think it's up to age 13 or something, you play on a softball team that is not school sponsored. I was going to add, having seen lots of girls hit softballs in that field, it is rare to see a girl hit a softball more than twice the length of the infield. So if you sort of draw a line that goes out there, there is space out there that is typically not used. Many softball fields have actual fences. If you go down to Volunteer Green, there are fences. And I'm not saying it's a good idea or a bad idea. I'm just saying that's how like baseball and softball works. You typically have a fence. You hit over the fence, it's a home run. But I have never, having seen hundreds of girls hit the softball, I have never seen a girl hit it as far as those property lines, which doesn't say it's impossible. I've never seen it happen. And my point is that there is potentially room for both open space softball and some modest housing as a concept.
This is Janet Morris. Can I ask a question?
Please.
It's a whole different nature of question, but I walk around in those ravines quite often. You can hike down there and from the cemetery next to us, and also from behind the ballpark there, or behind that the ballpark area. Yeah, right. You could hike down in there and walk a ways back. And anyway, that whole property is surrounded on 3 sides by ravines. Are there any environmental concerns that we should have about building some complex in there, and the rivers that are little creeks that are at the bottom of those ravines. I mean, I see a lot of stuff going down in there now, and I try to pick it up in the spring, like a hot tub and stuff like that. My pet peeve is that damn hot tub that's down in the ravine. But are there concerns like with some sort of large complex and then the runoff down into these ravines and the creeks, which ultimately go over to the Winooski River?
I'll jump in. I will say there are always concerns about a combination of trash. The history of Vermont is people see a ravine and they seem to want to throw trash in it. So that's one of our cultural histories that we have to deal with. But the other issue is of course, where you're going is stormwater and runoff. We know storms are more intense than they ever were. Some of you will remember the collapse of one of the banks up by the elementary school on the corner of the playground. So those are things to be very thoughtful about. Of course, you have any kind of development, you have to be thoughtful about stormwater, erosion, how you deal with stormwater. If you follow this all the way down, our stormwater is kind of in, mixed circumstances where you want a combination of catch basins. When you go into the Winooski, what you want to do is stop silt and phosphorus from going into the Winooski. So what you want to do coming off the hill is to stop it from eroding so quickly and from dumping sediment and phosphorus all the way. As somebody who's walked through these ravines with some regularity over about 30 years, they actually change shape. They actually are dynamic, and it's not obvious in a year or two, but over an extended period of years. So that is absolutely a consideration or a concern, like where could you even build feasibly without making erosion and stormwater problems worse? You have to control it.
Yeah, when you talk about the building at the upper end, like the top right of the corner towards Burnett Court, the ravine's really right there. It's tight up against that.
Yes, it is.
Right in there, yeah. So
The other thing that's was interesting to me when I walked around this property, which I had never been around after living here for many, many years, but is those ravines are all owned by somebody else. The ravines are not in this property. They're owned by the neighbors, the folks who live at the end of Burnett Court, who should obviously be in on these discussions at some point, because we followed footsteps, pretty well-worn tracks all down around through those ravines, and then got back and looked at the parcel map and found, oh, well, that's not actually on the town property. We're just walking on this neighbor's property in these ravines, and they, I guess, don't mind, but so they should definitely be involved in the discussions.
Can I ask a quick question?
I just wanted to say that I've seen a lot of recreational use in those trails too. So when we mention things that go on in this parcel of land, that's another thing. There's a lot of like snowshoeing and cross-country skiing and hiking.
I have a quick question. You've been talking to Cathedral Square and the Champlain Housing Authority. How much density are they looking for? How many units do they want to make a project viable?
So I'll jump in. This is Bart. And by talking, I will say I had about a 15-minute conversation with Cathedral Square and a 45-minute conversation with Champlain Housing Trust and others. Cathedral Square said 30. Champlain Housing Trust, Jay, remind me, did they say like 20? Does that sound right?
30 units. 24.
24 units. And this came up earlier. What's a unit? A unit is like a family unit. It could be a studio apartment. It could be a 4-bedroom apartment. Each one of those would be called a unit. It has an entry, a lockable door, and it's a place where a person or family group lives. So the size of the unit and the number of people living there is variable. It's probably not lost on us that senior housing has fewer people per household generally.
Yeah.
And there's less traffic in and out of senior housing than of other kinds of housing typically, in terms of the residents anyway.
Right. Another thing that keeps coming up is stories. And this is where we and CCRPC kind of have to beg to differ. CCRPC looks at the land that we've got and says, we could put 5 stories. And we go, using what ladder truck, you know?
Yeah.
Williston has a ladder truck, and we have not got, I mean, in terms of if there was a fire, they would come, but I don't think they would necessarily be sanguine about us telling them that they are our fallback plan for when our skyscrapers catch on fire. So realistically, we are limited in terms of how many units we can pack in there by our lack of a ladder truck.
Can I also ask, is there a definition for affordable housing?
Yeah, well, it's used in a variety of different ways, affordable housing. But there is a technical definition for it that involves the percentage of the income that you spend on your housing. So affordable housing that meets the technical definitions of affordable housing, you can't, it's limited to an income where only 1/3 of that is spent on the housing, about 30%. So, and affordable housing is generally, so it's subsidized in some way. Affordable housing, sort of the less technical part, means it's subsidized. Somebody is helping to make those units possible for people with modest incomes. The other way people talk about affordable housing is just, what is housing that we can afford? You know, regular teachers and firefighters and our police officers who have to live an hour away. You know, we need housing that's more affordable, market rate housing that's more affordable. That's something that we don't have that much control over, what the market rate is, except in terms of making small enough size units that are less costly to rent. But then, you know, people are living in very small units. So, but yes, there are technical definitions for what affordable housing is and what those levels have to be to qualify for affordable housing. There are also these supported senior housing concepts where seniors are supported by the housing being subsidized if, you know, they're over a certain age or disabled, like Richmond Terrace, where it is supported by various means, many financial mechanisms at work, such that the people who live there don't have to pay more than a certain amount of their income, a certain percentage of their income, for their rent or their mortgage. It's very technical. I mean,
Yeah.
and it's very complicated. In fact, one of the people that was in on this conversation with Champlain Housing Trust, their project, a project they were working on, had 7 different financing sources that were going to build and ensure that this property was going to be perpetually maintained at this lower rent. So one other thing I would add is that there are 2 properties in Richmond that are subsidized or affordable housing. One is Richmond Terrace that has 16 units. That's a Cathedral Square property. And the other one is Borden Street at the end of Railroad Street, which has 16 units. And both of those, according to their owners, Cathedral Square, Champlain Housing Trust, are marginal in terms of being able to support themselves. You know, the reason that you need more units is so that you can generate enough revenue to do the subsidizing part, to make it affordable. So those 2 small projects probably wouldn't be able to be built now because they're too small. The number of units are too few to actually make the financing of it work, which is complex. I don't know if that answers your question, Greg, but
It does, but it also concerns me that the scale of the project to go into that ball field would have to be so big. At least, what do you think? 20 units? 30 units?
Sounds
Well,
like-
That it
Greg,
would,
20
would-
probably anyway. Yeah.
I think what we heard from Champlain Housing Trust was 24.
yep,
And what we heard from Cathedral Square was 30. And so, depends how you view that compared to, how many units are in Jelena Court now? Do you remember, Virginia?
14, there are 14 units in that building, and the building that is proposed as building number 2 with the other 31 units would be twice that size.
So that's part of the scale. You think about it, and it's a really good question to say what's the scale they need and does it fit? Because that's really the question. And the question of what's allowable and what's feasible and desirable is really a good question. And I don't have an opinion yet. I think I have more questions than answers. Like I'd start with what's allowable. And then if we were going to put footprints of buildings, like if there were 3-story buildings of 24 with 8 units per floor, recognize Jelena Court has a first floor that's commercial, right? Then you go, well, what would the footprint of that be? And honestly, what I've done at times like this, I cut out a little square to scale and I start moving it around or a rectangle on the property and go, well, what would that look like? And if this conversation were to move forward, that's the kind of thing I'd be inclined to do. What would it look like? Where would parking go? And I think it's still over the horizon a bit, but those are the right questions to ask, I think.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has interested the Planning Commission is the Borden Street development, which most people do not find too over the top large, and that's because it consists of 8 duplexes. There are 16, it's on a 2-acre parcel. There are 16 units in the form of 8 duplexes, but they're very village scale. I mean, I think people don't like thinking about 30 units because it doesn't seem to be village scale. So those 8 duplexes, which are affordable units, would be kind of more compatible with the size of the village in a way, but the NGOs don't think that that's a viable kind of project anymore. So
because you can't make money.
well, you have to make enough money to support it. You know what I
Right.
mean? They're
Yeah.
not trying to make money. The NGOs aren't trying to make money from the housing. They're only trying to make enough money to keep them perpetually affordable so
Right.
that the rent is always $300 a month instead of $1,000 a month or whatever. You got to feed cash into that system. So, it's challenging. It's very challenging.
If I think, to be fair, making money, it's more, does it work financially? So they're not profit driven, but it has to have a scale like, okay, so you're going to go manage it and do property maintenance. They don't want to do one house in Jericho and one house in Underhill. They want some scale. They need property managers. So property management, somebody's got to mow the lawn, all those kinds of things. And so I think it is really appropriate to ask what the scale is. And I'm really daunted by scale. To be fair, to be transparent, when I was born, my parents lived on East Terrace. Do you know where that is in Burlington? Our backyard was a barbed wire fence, and then the other side was cows. Now on the other side is something like 450 apartment units. So that scale doesn't fit here. And I think it is really appropriate and prudent to ask what scale goes where, because you can, once you build it, it's there for a couple of generations, right? So it is really appropriate to be thoughtful about this. And I always sense a sense of concern and caution, like that change there is this threatening thing. What would that look like? You know, we don't want to put a 6-story building of 300 units on Browns Court or any other place in Richmond. So I think it's really prudent to ask, where would it go? What would the scale look like? And is there a confluence of considerations that work for the nonprofit organizations, the residents, and the town?
Hey, there's some, when we were talking about Borden Street, if you extended Borden Street out into the farmland behind it, that's not far, I don't think, right there. There's that small farm. And it starts at the end of Esplanade.
Esplanade.
I think it may be floodplain.
Okay.
So, I mean, most of that field is in the floodplain, that field behind Esplanade, Church Street, and
Okay.
Railroad Street. It's pretty much all, it's got to stay farmland because it's floodplain.
And right about in that intersection, having walked through it, there is kind of a natural stormwater outlet. There is a place where when the water goes through silt, it starts to find its own way. And it's kind of swampy in the spring anyway. So we don't have a map of that probably, but it is interesting. I will say it's instructive for any one of these properties to actually walk them beyond just looking at a map. When you walk them, you get a sense of what the terrain is, how wet it is or not, what kind of flora and fauna look like they are there. The flora, of course, easier than the fauna. But I think those are all things that we should contemplate together as members of the community.
Great. Well, just looking at time here, I know we're approaching, or we're just at 9 o'clock here, and wanted to see if there was any other final comments on Browns Court or any of these 4 properties that we looked at this evening before moving on.
These have been really informative for me, just getting to know my own town a little bit better and what some of the opportunities and the pluses and the barriers to looking at any of these options. Mark, do you have a feeling that you could share about, since we're not the housing committee doesn't make any decisions. The housing committee makes recommendations to the planning commission, which then takes work to the select board. So do you have a sense that we'll continue to have these conversations, or that we need to do more research, or we need to wait for there to be a planning director, or what do you think the next steps might be?
Well, on that subject, I don't know if word has officially been published, but we have hired a new town planner.
Wonderful. When does he or she start?
March 27th. Yeah.
Very nice. Soon. That's great. Thanks, Jay. Appreciate that.
Perfect. Yeah, so I'd say a part of that is, yes, waiting for a town planner to help with assist. I think for us as the housing committee, part of this was to help organize our thoughts and then look at, are there ways for us to both look at, the needs of our broader community, the needs of the community here, and that obviously live here in Richmond, and investigate or go on a path of like, hey, is there a potential property that we could help? Maybe not just a property, but a potential way for us to help encourage affordable housing, encourage housing in our community. As you know, there's a vast housing shortage across Chittenden County and across Vermont, and that feeds directly into our local businesses, right? I think it was mentioned earlier about folks living an hour plus away that maybe work here in Richmond because they can't afford to live here. There's obviously environmental impacts as well, and so looking at where can we as a committee help support both what the town residents need, want, and those of our broader community. So I guess, Connie, that was a little bit of a circle around your question there. Like, the hope was, we've been talking about some of these areas here. Are there some that are maybe just more viable than another that we could maybe put our efforts behind to help support some type of work being done?
So sounds like further conversations in future meetings once the town planner gets oriented and in place. I'd like to take a question. Kristen, you joined us partway through, and I don't know your last name. Would you just say hello and tell us, I assume you're a Richmond resident, but we were all kind of sharing where we were living.
Yes, hi, sorry, I'm a little bit late. But yes, I'm Kristen Bednar is my last name. I just moved back and just moved to Browns Court, so I'm part of the contingent from there. So
From Browns Court. Oh, that's great. Thank you, Kristen, and welcome.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're here.
Thanks.
Perfect.
So I just wanted to say, I'm just below y'all at Tilden Avenue.
Yeah.
That's
Yep.
right.
I would just like to say thank you for everybody coming out. I'm not a member of the housing committee, but if we're going to get anywhere, we can't leave it to 3 people, no matter how hard they work.
Totally
Well,
true.
new members for the housing committee.
Yeah, that's a great plug into, we are a committee of 3 members here. So, if you have an interest in these discussions around, right, what can we do here in Richmond? What is possible? We'd love to have you participate and hear your voice here.
I think Gina had a question.
Yes,
I did. I just had a quick question. I know we're trying to wrap up here, but is there a reason, thinking forward, why we're like so focused on just say Browns Court? I mean, probably you wouldn't do the senior housing because of someone mentioned the roller coaster ride to the town. It just doesn't seem like a great sidewalk for seniors to trying to be commuting that way. But if you were to do affordable housing, you'd still need to do 24 units there. And 24 seems like really, just say instead of doing that, you focused on, there's so much grant money for accessory dwelling units. And if you accept a grant, you have to agree to rent the place out at an affordable unit. And the HUD rate is, I believe, 1,612 for like a 2-bedroom. Why aren't we focusing on, kind of trying to help people here and there have an additional unit at an affordable rate, or maybe some of the, the Airbnbs or something like that, as opposed to making one big development? Is there a benefit to that, or is there a reason we're not? I mean, because to me, I'm all about multi-generational, like having the seniors with the little ones in community. And once you take one big, I almost want to say like a facility, and you put like only seniors here or affordable here, and affordable isn't really that affordable anyways in some cases. But is there a reason we're not looking at just like spreading these out and making our community more integrated?
I'll jump in. I think it's a really good question, that how do we expand housing and affordable housing across everything? I'll just say, every time we have a conversation about more housing, here's what happened on my street, Tilden Avenue. So for those of you who can picture it, walk down. The 2 older buildings on my street are now gone. I am the oldest house on the street. There was a house at the end that was being knocked down and replaced. And there was a conversation, we make it a duplex or a triplex. The neighbors were adamant that 3 is too many. 2 is a better number. 1 would be a better number. So I just see this tension everywhere about infill. I don't know how to say this, but it seems like everywhere I go, people think it should go somewhere else. There should be more housing somewhere else. not here, not on my street, not on that street. And that, I think it, and I don't want to be negative, I think it's because people perceive their current environment as a desirable environment. People like where they live, like it the way it is. And so I think we should just accept that. It is what it is. So what do we do with that? I'm not entirely sure. I know the legislature is dealing with this, trying to deal with ADUs like infill and making towns accept certain things. I will say I have a bias. It's informed by my father's experience as a mid-century architect. He built many of the houses on East Terrace, who said he left Vermont as an architect because he didn't want to build houses on the hillside and destroy the hillside. This is a guy who grew up on a farm and had walked in the hillsides where there was nothing there. Back in his day, you could take your .22 rifle and walk out into the woods and shoot at stuff, right? And that time is gone. But I'll say I'm also informed by that his observation, if you're going to fill things in and be efficient and protect the environment, you should have livable, desirable villages and tend to protect the hillsides and the views and everything else. Not everyone agrees with that. I'll just say that that's like what I grew up on, for what that's worth.
So the Planning Commission is dealing with all these issues. So we are dealing with the gentle infill question, trying to slowly promote some infill. We are dealing with ADUs, and on the subject of ADUs, I want to mention that there's a program currently, a funding mechanism for ADUs. It was just in 7 days, and it is the Department of Housing and Community Development, and they're giving grants of up to $50,000 to put ADUs. So you will want to look into that if you're interested in ADUs. So the Planning Commission has liberalized some of those ADU requirements. You know, Gina, I think we're trying to work across all these fronts. You know, basically the affordable housing front, which needs volume, the small scale infill. We're soon going to be talking about the outlying areas, how we can have clustered housing that do protect those hillsides, but on the other hand, you know, they allow for more housing. It's not going to be walkable to the village. It's not going to have sewer and water, but maybe someday we'll be able to have public trans to connect these places. And at least there will be more housing in general that is not maybe, you know, doesn't necessitate the sidewalk so much. You can have community septic systems. It's, you know, it's not like you have to have municipal water and sewer to do everything, but that is an efficient way to develop, is to use your infrastructure that you have, your water and sewer that you have, your sidewalks, you know, where your services are concentrated. That is a good place for development. So, you know, it's an educational process. And I think, frankly, that people in Richmond who love it just the way it is, and we can understand that, are seeing that if you don't have housing, you won't have people to work here. You won't have people, you know, to be police officers and teachers. And so the baseline, I think, is changing a little bit for people. We just hope that we're doing it slowly enough that it's not too scary and horrifying for people. I mean, it'll be a slightly different baseline. We have more people. We need more housing. It's going to have to be a different baseline somehow. So we just try to do it as well as we can so it remains a nice place to live. And there are plenty of amenities and people still want to live here, but that there are more places to live. So in answer to your question, the Planning Commission really is grappling with all those directions that you mentioned. And I would definitely look into the ADU granting program right now because it's out there.
Can I just phone? I have I have the whole packet and all the
Yes.
information if anyone wants it. There is
Great.
so much. It's a second round, and it's only until the funds are gone. The last round went very quickly, but
Yeah.
it's available for, hopefully some members of our community are in a position to do it. And it's 5 years that you need to rent it at an affordable rate.
Yeah,
And then after that, I guess, if you just create one ADU.
yeah. And maybe what would be useful in Richmond would be to try to keep bringing, these opportunities to people's knowledge, because, I had no idea about this program until I read it in 7 days. So, why we need somehow a mechanism for understanding all these grant programs that the state is trying to help with the housing situation by having grant, and there's money available at the moment. So anyway,
Exactly. That's what's happened, I think, with this grant. The first round came and left before anyone, well, before I even had heard of it. And then the second round's already been in place before it's even
Right.
announced. So, but
and maybe with our new planner, we can set him on that task of gathering together this information and publicizing it a little better so that people know what money is out there and what they can do with it.
Great. Well, thank you, Gina, for bringing
Thank you.
that up. So I'm going to suggest we had a couple other items on the agenda. We're going to talk about neighborhood development areas. Virginia, maybe we talk about that next
Yeah.
session. Any quick updates from the Planning Commission that you wanted to share with the committee, Virginia?
No, just that what we're doing right now is we have given to the select board our residential commercial district revisions that you all are aware of. The Gateway District and the Village Residential Commercial District are now in the hands of the select board, or they will be shortly. Josh has them. So you should watch, members of the committee, watch out for those public hearings that the select board will be holding about those districts. They do allow for more multifamily housing, slight changes, slight density increases, nothing huge, little more lot coverage so that there's more room for a few more buildings. So that is over to the select board, and we're now going to go back to talking about the village neighborhoods. Bard, your neighborhood, we're going to talk about it again. And also the South Village neighborhood, which is the Thompson Road area, Lower Bridge Street, Thompson Road, Cochran Road. We're going to talk about those. We got a fair amount of input the last time we talked about them. So we're going to just review that. And so anyone who's in those districts will keep watching for that, and you can come to our hearings on that. But hopefully, for people who are interested in housing, if you would like to support the work that we've done on the residential commercial districts at the select board level, that would be good.
I have one other question, and maybe I missed this because I joined late. And at the risk of talking about other people's property, which is difficult, it's obvious as a resident of Tilden that the Goodwin Baker building used to be a major employer, and some of the buildings around here were built for workers to live. I don't know if there's anything you want to say. Is the Goodwin Baker building on the radar at all? Again, if you just think of the criteria, it's got water, sewer, sidewalk, parking area.
The Goodwin Baker building is included in our new proposal for a residential commercial district. Previously, housing was not allowed in that building. Under the new proposal, having moved Millet Street and the Goodwin Baker building into the residential commercial district, multifamily housing is possible. So a conditional use, 5+ units. Sid Miller, who's the owner of that building, is interested in housing because he often finds it tenuous to maintain it all as commercial space. So he and I have talked. He's interested in housing there. It would be a good place for housing with all those advantages. It's on the edge of a neighborhood, but the other option is having a lot of commercial activities there. It seems like on the edge of a neighborhood, maybe residential is better. So that would be now up to him. We have removed, if it's passed by the select board, it's up to him but we have removed the barrier to him having residential uses in that building.
Well, thank you. So I call that out because it illustrates to Gina's question that, yeah, there's like multiple things. It's like there's a lot of horses in the race, or if we're going to address housing and affordable housing, there's probably multiple strategies. You can't solve it with one fell swoop, one thing. We're not going to build. Anybody know what Cabrini Green is in Chicago?
I sure do.
We're not doing that.
No.
We're not
And-
building a like 25-story building of and multiples of them, you know, so the scale is important. And my real point is that multiple strategies are probably prudent and necessary to try to address housing and affordable housing.
And the other thing the Planning Commission is looking at right now is short-term rentals, which is a problem for depleting the housing stock in general. So depleting rental housing in particular, and some, you know, house rentals, whole house rental, apartment rentals. Some of it is being taken up by short-term rentals. So we are addressing that. We don't know if it's a problem really in Richmond exactly, but that's the first step, is really to find out whether or not it's a problem. We know that there are quite a number of short-term rentals. So that's the second thing that is that we're working on currently. So if you're interested in that question, yeah, check the agenda of our meetings. We'll be talking about that.
Great. Thank you, Virginia. And I think that's you know, to your point there, Bard. That's the point of having the discussions like tonight, is to talk about what are the possibilities in Richmond, and see where we can provide support to that. So, all right. So just moving on. Jay and Bard, I know you were both special guests here. Anything else you wanted to add this evening in relation to?
Nope.
I just say thanks. I am struck, not on a daily basis, but a weekly basis, how the interests of the town, the citizens, taxpayers, et cetera, are moved forward by interested and committed citizens. So both for you on the group and those who joined tonight, this is how it works. And it's not always pretty, but it is the only thing that works. So thank you.
Yes,
Great.
thank you indeed.
Great. Well, thank you for joining. And our other guests here tonight, thank you for joining and sharing your thoughts and opinions and perspective as well. So you're welcome back at any point. And again, anyone interested in joining the housing committee, feel free to reach out to myself, and I can point you in the right direction. Perfect. So I think we're just wrapping up here. Any other business to discuss tonight?
Our next meeting is in April the 13th at 7:30. And so for the proposed agenda, we'll probably include the review of neighborhood development areas that we couldn't talk about tonight, and probably another update from the Planning Commission.
Yes, and I know the name has not been released. I don't know who it is, but maybe an invitation out to our next town planner would be great to have for next time as well.
And the town planner is staff to this committee. One of
Yes, so
the
I guess
tasks,
they will have
the
to.
town
They will have
planner
to show.
is staffing this committee. So it doesn't necessarily mean he has to come to the meetings, but he is assigned to take care of us and
Perfect.
help us.
All right. Well, again, really appreciate your time, thoughts, and discussion this evening. So it is 9:22, and I call the March 9th Housing Committee, and we will close tonight, only to reconvene in April, I think it was 13th. So
Good night,
again,
everybody.
really
Thanks,
appreciate it.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thanks.
Good
Bye,
night.
Virginia. Night, everyone.
Bye.